Hi guys, welcome back to my channel. I'm so glad you stopped by today because today we are finally going to do our Halloween special. Throughout the month we've been doing a few different creepy creatures. The first one was a raven griffin. The second was a hybrid between a spider and a bat. And today we are going to be making a beholder from D&D. Anyways, let's get started. Okay, so the first thing that we need to make our beholder is the giant eyeball. And the main reason I wanted to start with this was I actually wasn't sure if this was even going to work out. So if this didn't work out, there was no reason to continue making the beholder. So we need to get the eyeball done first to make sure we can actually do this. So my idea for the giant eye is to make the iris out of clay and then to cast it in resin. So let's get started on the iris. For this, I ended up rolling my clay nice and flat. I think I have it about 1/4 of an inch thick. That way I still have something to work with. I don't want it too thin. And I made a little paper pattern to figure out the size of the iris, and I used that to cut out the shape that I needed. Then what I did was I just took my tools and I added a ton of lines. I just kind of went back and forth over the entire surface trying to create all the little wrinkles that would be in the iris. For this, I highly recommend to not try and stick to a pattern or anything. I kept it as random as possible. Some of the lines are deeper than others, some are thinner than others, and some are chunkier than others, just to create a very organic feel to the sculpture. So I just kind of kept messing around with the texture of everything until I liked how it looked, and then I put it in the oven for about 45 minutes at 275 Fahrenheit. Once my clay was out of the oven and cooled to touch, I could start painting the iris. For this, I decided that I wanted to go with a green because the body of my beholder, I'm going to go with a red, and I figured they would contrast really nicely together. So with my painting, I started off with a very dark green and I slowly transitioned to a brighter green and then to a yellow as I got closer to the middle of the eye. And then for my extra details, for the highlights and stuff, I decided to use a gold paint. I lightly brushed over the surface of the eye, and then I also picked a portion that I wanted to really highlight with that gold. So you're probably wondering how we're going to end up casting this into an eye. And at first I was thinking I could use a bowl, but all my bowls have a bottom to it that is flat, and that's not going to work to create that dome shape. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take some cellophane and I'm going to attach it to the top of a bowl really tightly, and I'm going to tape it around so it's nice and firm. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to fill this with resin and let the resin's weight pull it down into a dome shape. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to add a little bit of resin to our cellophane, and then for our iris, I'm going to coat it in a layer of resin ahead of time. I'm not going to let it cure. It's going to still be wet when we add it to the other resin. I'm just doing this to avoid air bubbles. I figured it'd be easier to avoid air bubbles if I painted it into all of the cracks and crevices first. So I did that, and I took the iris and I flipped it upside down and I slowly set it into the resin. I made sure to kind of adjust it, and I did have a few air bubbles, so I kind of messed around with this for quite a while, and I didn't get all the air bubbles out, but I got probably 90-95% of the air bubbles gone, so I was pretty happy with that. Also, I kind of risked melting the plastic wrap because I wasn't sure if it would react to the heat of the resin too bad. It did a little bit, but it didn't melt. So I was really lucky with that, and I honestly should have tested it out first. Anyways, I left the eye alone overnight to cure, and then the following morning I could peel it out of our plastic wrap. And thankfully it looks really good, so we can continue making our beholder. I was really worried that this wasn't gonna work. Okay, so our big eye is all finished. Now we need to make some smaller eyes. So I'm going to be doing basically the same thing, but on a smaller level. And thankfully, I actually have some molds that we can use, so I don't have to make some makeshift thing like we did with this eye. So I'm going to make 6 smaller eyes that are going to be on some tentacle stalks. And what we're going to do is we're going to make the irises roughly about the size of a washer, kind of a larger washer. And I'm going to sculpt those, paint them, and then we're going to put them in our resin molds. So I'm going to fill my molds with some resin, and I'm going to set these on the very top of our resin as they're curing. So we're going to let those sit overnight, and then we can pop them out as well and see if they actually look okay. And then of course, just like the other eye, we're going to paint the backing of them black. Okay, so now that we have the eyes done, the only other thing that we need to make out of resin are the teeth. So I have a mold right now that I used to make claws, and I figured it would work well for the teeth for a beholder. So I'm going to make a bunch of teeth out of resin, and then I'm just going to have them attached to some cardboard so they're easier to paint, and I'm going to paint them white, and then kind of muddy them up with a little bit of watered down kind of brown paint. We're going to let those dry, and then once everything is dried, we can resin over these to protect the paint. Okay, and that is the last of our hard pieces. The rest of this is going to be pretty much sewing. So I've got my pattern pieces, and we're going to work piece by piece because there is a lot, and I'm making a very large beholder. So let's start with our giant eye and adding some eyelids to it. So what I ended up doing was I started with a round pattern, and this is going to be the fabric that's going to be on the back of the eye. And then I sketched out the shapes for the upper and lower eyelids. The upper and lower eyelids are both going to have 2 sides. One is going to be against the eye, and the other is going to be the outer portion of the eyelid. And what we're going to do is we're going to pin these 2 layers together and sew along the outer side. So this is going to be kind of the lip of the eyelid. Next, I'm going to flip these right side out, pin them together again, and sew the other side of the eyelid closed. Now I also want to stuff these so that they're not super flat. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to cut a tiny little slit in the backing of them, and I'm going to add some stuffing to them and then close them back up. And then I'm going to take our fabric for the backing. I'm going to lay our eye on top of that, and then I'm going to take the eyelids and I'm going to lay those over the eye. I can then pin these all together and sew around the base of everything, locking our eyeball inside of the fabric. Now I'm going to move on to our smaller eyes and making our tentacle stalks. So I have a simple pattern that we're going to have a left and right for, and I'm going to cut some fabric out and I'm going to sew the front portion of all of these together. So again, I have 6 of these. I'm going to sew them together, and then what we're going to do is we're going to take our eyes and we're going to add them to a wire frame. So I'm going to glue a wire to the backing of our eye. And then I'm going to take the fabric and we can glue the fabric around the base of the eye, just kind of closing everything up. There wasn't much of an edge to my eyes, so this was a little tricky, but eventually I did get it to work. Then I let everything dry, and then I stuffed and closed up the tentacle. So I got all 6 of our eye tentacles done, and now what we're going to do is we're going to move on to making the pieces for the mouth. Okay, so the first thing we're going to make for our mouth are some gums that our teeth are going to go into. So for this, I have kind of a more pink color of fabric, and for this I just have strips of fabric for the gums, one for each side. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to start sewing, and I'm going to glue our teeth into place. So I'm going to sew a little, glue a tooth in place, sew a tiny bit, glue another tooth until I have all the teeth that can fit in our gums laid out. Next, we need to make some lips, and what we're going to do is we're going to make a top lip and a bottom lip. And the bottom lip is going to be a lot larger and more U-shaped, and I'm going to kind of have this where it will hold our beholder up so he can just kind of sit there and not fall forward, because his eye is kind of heavy and I am worried about him falling forward. So the lips are going to be put together the same way we did the eyelids. We're going to sew the outer edge first, flip everything right side out, sew the other edge, cut a little hole in them so we can stuff them, and then close them back up. And then on the side where we have our cut for where we stuffed everything, I'm going to roughly kind of sketch out with a very similar color of marker, so you might not see it on camera, but I sketched out where I'm going to lay the gums, and I'm going to start sewing these in place on the lip. And then the last thing that we need for his mouth is a tongue. So I made this really cool pattern of a wavy tongue with a forked end, and I'm just going to take my fabric. I'm going to have a top and bottom for it. I've got 2 layers pinned together, and I'm going to sew around it. Once I have it sewn, I'm then going to flip it right side out, lightly stuff it, sew the end of it closed, and then I'm going to take my sewing machine and I'm going to sew right down the middle of it, breaking up the tongue. So for the pattern for his body, we're going to have some large sections, and we're going to do 4 of these. Now obviously the body is going to be a red color to match the rest of the pieces that we have, but I want to add a little bit of fur fabric to his back, just to kind of add a bit more detail to him and make him look less like a beach ball. So I have sections sketched out on where we're going to have little triangles of fur fabric, and I'm going to sew these pieces of fur onto each of the 4 sections. Then we're going to take our 4 sections and we're going to sew all of them together into one solid piece. Now we're not going to sew them all the way closed because we're going to leave one side open so we can stuff everything. And then what we're going to do is, for the very back portion of him, this is also going to be fur fabric, and it's going to be a round section. This is going to be the same size as the backing of our eyeball. So I'm going to sew everything to that one round section. And then we're going to take our eye and we're going to do the exact same thing. Take the fabric of the body and sew all the way around the base of the eye. Now what you'll have is pretty much a deflated beach ball with an eye on one end and fur on the other. And what we're going to do is we're going to stuff this and close up the last side that we have open. So this is going to take a lot of stuffing because of how large I decided to go, but eventually I got him all stuffed. And now that the body is all stuffed, we can start adding the mouth and the eye tentacles, and we're even going to add some scale armor to him. So let's start with his mouth. So what I did was I figured out the layout of where his lips are going to go, and I made a backing piece of fabric out of a really dark red color. That way it'll look like the inside of his mouth. So I pinned the backing of his mouth in place on the body, and then I just lightly stitched it in place. And then we're going to take the tongue that we made and we can sew that in place. So I'm going to basically sew it from the underside, so everything's upside down right now. I'm going to stitch it in place, and then we can start adding our lips. Moving on to the top of him, I'm going to make a bunch of different pieces of armor. So I want these to be layered. I ended up making a ton of different pattern pieces and numbering them so I could keep track of how they go. And I'm going to cut these out of some fake leather. I have some really cool red kind of scaly fake leather, and I'm going to use this for the armor. So I'm going to start down the middle of him, and then we're also going to do his sides. So I'm going to start sewing our scale pieces in place, and then in between each scale piece I have a very tiny bit of fur fabric that I want to place there, just to have it look a little bit fuller. So basically I'm sewing scales, gluing fur fabric, sewing scales, gluing fur fabric until I get to the point where I want to add an eye tentacle. So for this I have the scale shaped a little bit differently, and I am going to make some alterations so it doesn't like move the scales weirdly. I'm going to kind of cut some divots for the eye tentacle to stick out. And basically how I'm attaching the eye tentacle is I'm putting down a large amount of hot glue, and I'm gluing the wire that's inside of our eye tentacle to the body. Then I'm going to sew around the base of this, and then if anything looks a little weird, I can add some fur fabric around it. Then I can continue doing our scale armor until I want to add another tentacle. So again, I'll do the same thing. I'll finish up the very top of our armor, and then I'm going to do the sides. And then I'm also going to have more tentacles, of course, because we have 6 of them down the sides of our beholder. So I'm going to get all of his tentacles and his armor in place and finish him up. He almost doesn't fit in frame. Okay guys, and here is our beholder. I had so much fun making him. He took absolutely forever. I even had my glue gun kind of explode on me in the middle of finishing up his scales. So I had to buy a new glue gun just to finish him up. But I'm so happy that he is all done. His mouth, oh my god. Now the only sad thing is I'm gonna have to keep him. I can't put him up for sale. I don't own any rights to the beholder. The beholder isn't a just well-known mythical creature. It is copywritten by D&D. So I can't place it on my Etsy shop or anything like that, but I really wanted to make one for today's video. So I'm gonna have to find him a cool place to hang out in my apartment, and maybe you'll see him later on in other videos. Anyways guys, happy Halloween. Thank you guys so much for watching. Make sure to like, subscribe to all that fun stuff, and I'll see you guys next time. Bye!